The sea. Thousands upon thousands of miles of empty water. The world's oceans are as beautiful as they are deadly. If a ship encounters trouble far from land, there is little those on board can do, except hope for rescue. Though sinking may seem to be the worst that can happen to a ship at sea, it's actually fire that creates the most horrific pain and suffering. Because not only does a fire at sea mean a ship is going down, but passengers and crew have two choices: be burned alive or jump into an unforgiving ocean. A fire aboard ship is indiscriminate in its attack, taking the lives of everyone from immigrants seeking a new life to cruise ship elite looking for a good time on the waves. Throughout the ages, there are thousands of stories of horrific fires at sea, but many of the most infamous are not well known. The images that tell their tales are remarkable, haunting, and rarely seen. Now, with restored film footage and high-definition photo technology, we can look deep inside these seagoing stories of heroism and tragedy to fully understand what happens aboard ship when there is a fire at sea. Asbury Park, New Jersey. Located in the northern part of what's known as the Jersey Shore. This beach town, complete with a miles-long boardwalk, is the summertime respite for New Yorkers and Jersey residents alike, looking for a fun place to beat the heat. It's been that way for more than 100 years. During the decades, Asbury Park has seen its share of disasters. Hurricanes, flooding, drownings. But nothing in the city's history can compete with the events on the morning of September 8, 1934. 3 miles offshore, the fiery hulk of a passenger ship steams north through choppy waters. Hundreds of people are pulled from the roiling sea. Some alive, many dead. The ship, the SS Morro Castle, winds up beaching itself on the shore directly adjacent to the Asbury Park Convention Center. It is a horrific and bewildering scene. How the Morro Castle winds up here, and how 137 passengers and crew die, is the stuff of maritime legend. It begins 4 years earlier when the Morro Castle is built and launched by the Ward Line, a company that specializes in sending ships up and down the east coast of North and South America, carrying passengers on dream vacations. The Morro Castle has one of the best runs of them all, from New York City to Havana, Cuba, and back again, all in under a week. But the stories of the Morro Castle are more than those of just great parties. It is rumored that the ship's owner, the Ward Line, has accepted money from revolutionaries in Cuba to smuggle in weapons from the United States, though nothing has ever been proved. Early evening, September 7th, 1934. The Morro Castle is on its return voyage to New York. It's scheduled to arrive early the next morning. The ship is crashing through rough seas. A major storm has been brewing along the East Coast, and the Morro Castle is plowing through some serious Atlantic chop and 30-mile-an-hour winds. Still, it is weather the ship can handle. But everything changes around 8 p.m. The ship's captain, Robert Wilmot, tells crew members he isn't feeling well and he's going to lie down in his cabin. An hour later, he is found dead of a heart attack. Command of the ship is turned over to Chief Officer William Worms, a much less experienced seaman. Just before 3 a.m., thick smoke starts pouring from a storage locker in the ship's first-class writing room, located on B deck. Within minutes, flames have burst from the locker and are ripping through the writing room, spreading to surrounding hallways and offices. The Morro Castle is on fire. It doesn't take long for the fire to spread and wreak havoc throughout the ship. It burns the wiring of its electrical system, plunging the Morro Castle into darkness. Chief Officer Worms attempts to beach the ship, but the fire has cut the vessel's hydraulic lines, leaving the crew no way to steer. Crews on other ships see a strange glow on the horizon during the night. The Morro Castle's radio officer, George Rogers, becomes a hero because he sends out the only SOS before the Morro Castle loses all power. The churning seas and confusing lack of information compounds any rescue efforts for other vessels to reach the burning ship. Passengers and crew members scramble in the darkness to the deck, waiting for daybreak and a chance to escape. There are 12 lifeboats on board, not enough for the 549 passengers and crew. Some of the davits for the lifeboats are covered with so much paint they cannot be freed for use. The Morro Castle becomes a raging inferno. Passengers have a choice: burn or jump. Many jump into the high seas with life preservers around them and wind up drowning or breaking their necks in the 60-foot fall. What was supposed to have been a celebratory final night at sea has descended into madness. First, with the death of the ship's captain, and then by a suspicious fire, which has turned the Morro Castle into a flaming, floating coffin. New York Harbor. It's here that millions of immigrants came ashore 100 years ago, searching for a better life. And it's here that people who live in New York escape the grit and grime of the city by taking day-long cruises on steamships built exclusively for running up and down the Hudson and East Rivers. One of those ships is called the General Slocum, named after Civil War hero and New York Congressman Henry Warner Slocum. The Slocum is built in a Brooklyn dry dock in 1891. She is 235 feet long and 37 feet wide. She has 3 decks, 3 watertight compartments, and 250 electric lights. The General Slocum is powered by 2 paddle wheels, one on each side of the ship. Each wheel has 26 massive paddles that push the Slocum through the water at a respectable speed of 16 knots. The ship has a crew of 22, under the command of Captain William H. Van Schaik. In the decades after it launches, the Slocum is plagued by many mishaps. It runs aground several times, with passengers having to be hoisted from the landlocked ship. But none of that compares to the morning of June 15th, 1904. It is a Wednesday, and the Slocum has been chartered by St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church from the Little Germany district of Manhattan. The cost of the church's charter is $350. More than 1,400 church members board the Slocum, most of them women and children. The ship leaves its dock at 9:30 a.m. and is to sail up the East River, then eastward across the Long Island Sound to Locust Grove, a picnic site at Eaton's Neck, Long Island. But as the ship passes 90th Street, a fire starts in its lamp room in the forward part of the Slocum. The fire quickly spreads, fueled by straw, oil, and oily rags that are strewn about the room. Deckhand John J. Coakley sees the smoke and attempts to put the fire out. But when he opens the door to the lamp room, he lets in a huge draft of air, which causes a massive fireball to explode. The General Slocum is ablaze and in serious trouble. Frantic passengers grab for life jackets, which have been stowed in the ceiling compartments of the Slocum since its launch 13 years earlier. The jackets are made from cheap cork. Mothers put the life jackets on their children and throw them into the river in an effort to save them from the flames, only to watch the cork jackets fill with water and pull the helpless kids beneath the waves. To make matters worse, almost none of the immigrants on board know how to swim, and they are all wearing heavy woolen clothing. When the passengers jump into the water, their clothes quickly become saturated, making it impossible for anyone to stay afloat. Captain von Schayak keeps the Slocum going at full steam, not wanting to pull the ship into a dock and risking a fire on land. This only fans the flames, turning the Slocum into a waterborne inferno. Passengers jump overboard to escape the flames, but many are sucked under and thrashed to death by the still turning paddle wheels. By the time the Slocum beaches itself at North Brother Island, just off the Bronx shore, the ship's floors collapse, sending hundreds more to a watery grave. An estimated 1,021 people have either burned to death or drowned. "321 passengers survive. It's said that when husbands return home from work that evening, the entire Lower East Side of the city is empty. None of their families survived. It takes days for authorities to retrieve the bodies and to raise the ship from the bottom of the river. Coffins are stacked high at Brother Island. New York's City Hall is draped in black, mourning the massive loss of life. Funerals are held for weeks. At the coroner's inquest, Frank Barnaby, president of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company, which owned the Slocum, is grilled on why work orders for repairs that should have been made to the ship were forged. Though accusations are leveled at nearly everyone associated with the disaster, the only person convicted of a crime is Captain von Schayak, who is found guilty of criminal negligence for failing to maintain fire drills and fire extinguishers aboard ship. He is sentenced to 10 years in prison, but is paroled after serving only 3.5. The General Slocum tragedy remains the greatest ship disaster in the history of New York City, and was responsible for the greatest loss of life in the city's history until the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The Slocum burned so badly because her captain ran the fiery ship into the wind. The same thing happens 3 decades later off the shore of New Jersey, not long after crew members of the Morro Castle passenger ship first report a fire on B deck. The Morro Castle goes up in flames in the middle of the night, and everything that can go wrong does. Only 6 of the 12 lifeboats are launched during the fire, carrying a total of just 85 people, most of them members of the crew. Residents frantically tow lifeboats to the shore. Lifeguards pull hard against the pounding surf to get their boats out to sea. Local ships head out looking for survivors. Dozens of people who either swim for land or who are swept toward the shore by the current are pulled from the roiling surf by lifeguards and onlookers. Nearly drowned, many of those who survive the 3-mile watery trek have to be resuscitated once they're pulled onto the beach.
What an end to a joyous 17-day cruise of the Caribbean. Aroused from sleep only a few hours from home and in scanty night attire, hurled into a maelstrom of death, they are still too stunned to tell a coherent story of those hours of terror. They only know they're still alive and wonder why.
I had a bellboy on my life belt that didn't have no life belt or life preserve on. So they took him on and left me there. And 3 hours later, one of the boats picked me up.
Survivors, either pulled from the surf or plucked from the ocean by rescue ships, tell horrifying tales of having to jump into the water or be burned alive.
Well, about 5 o'clock, I guess the only thing to do was to jump overboard. I followed the first girl over, and I don't know where she got the courage to jump over. Well, anyway, I followed her, seeing that she could do it. I guess I'm lucky to be alive, that's all.
As you see, I have a watch here that stopped exactly at 25 minutes to 5. That's the time I jumped in the water. And from then on, I hung around the water, trying my best not to get all excited, for 7 hours.
We were in the water 5 hours. All except there was another girl in our party who was in another room, and we couldn't find her, and I still don't know whether she has been rescued or not. I'm hoping very much that she was.
On the beach, survivors and rescuers struggle to make sense of the tragedy unfolding before them. As rescue ships search the waters for survivors, the U.S. cutter Tampa attaches a cable to the bow of the Morro Castle in an attempt to tow the fiery wreck north to New York. But the weight of the ship, combined with the stress caused by the high seas, snaps the tow line, and the Morro Castle heads straight for the Jersey shore. With heavy surf pushing the ship toward land, there is nothing stopping it from running straight into the beach. On the east side of Cuba's Havana harbor, several stories above the crashing surf, is what remains of a once mighty fortress called the Morro Castle. Built in 1589 and designed by Italian engineer Juan Battista Anatoli, the fort was built to help stop raids launched from the sea on the city of Havana. It was originally under the control of Spain. Overtaken by the British in 1762, it was returned to Spain a year later, and this imposing rock balustrade is the namesake of the cruise ship Morro Castle. In the late 1800s, Cuba is struggling for its independence from Spain. The United States, which is isolationist when it comes to problems in other countries, does not intervene, despite Cuba being only 90 miles south of Florida and the U.S. having a general disdain for the Spanish. Quietly, however, many inside the U.S. military, government, and in big business are looking for an excuse to go to war. It's in the waters just offshore from the fortress Morro Castle that those officials will soon get what they need. One of the most infamous explosions and fires at sea that ever occurred. The USS Maine, a United States warship constructed in the late 19th century, is built out of necessity. At the time, the United States Navy is weak. Its commanders feel that it will be impossible to protect U.S. coastal cities from an attack by sea. When the Brazilian Navy in 1883 launches its ironclad warship Retialo, giving Brazil, along with its other warships, what was considered to be the finest navy in the Western Hemisphere, U.S. military commanders know they are in trouble. The chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee, Hillary Herbert, says to Congress, quote, "If all this old navy of ours were drawn up in battle array in mid-ocean and confronted by the Retialo, it is doubtful whether a single vessel bearing an American flag would make it back to port." In response, the U.S. begins building 2 huge warships at the shipyards in Brooklyn, New York, the Texas and the USS Maine. The steel-sided ships are an answer to Brazil's saber-rattling and an effort to ensure that the U.S. can do more than just protect its own shores. It can attack other ships at sea as well. But the Maine seems cursed from its start. It takes 9 years from when its keel is laid until she is ready to be put into service. There are problems with the U.S. steel industry at the time. Overwhelmed by work orders in the new industrial age and suffering from wildcat strikes by laborers demanding more rights, strangely and perhaps prophetically, there is a fire in the drawing room of the building yard where the Maine's working set of blueprints are stored. Engineers go to work. They draw up new blueprints. But the plans are more complicated than the original, causing further delays in getting the newly designed Maine constructed and into the water. On November 18, 1889, hundreds of spectators gather at the Navy shipyards in Brooklyn, New York, for the launch of the USS Maine. Underneath the entire length of the 324-foot-long ship, builders hammer in wedges that will lift the Maine from the blocks on which it was built to launching ways as a new support. Now, crews with large 2-man saws begin cutting away at the sole piece, a large timber of oak, that holds back the tremendous pull of the huge ship. During the last moments that the saw's teeth cut through the oak, the Maine begins to groan. Alice Tracy Wilmerding, granddaughter of Navy Secretary Benjamin F. Tracy, swings a huge bottle of champagne that shatters on the Maine's bow just as she begins to slide her way down the launchway and into the water. In 1895, the Maine joins the U.S. fleet patrolling the east coast of the United States. Part of the Maine's armaments include 4 18-inch torpedo tubes that can be fired in rapid succession, either at enemy ships or submarines. In addition to its on-deck large cannons, the Maine comes with a full complement of lighter but deadly weaponry. 6 6-inch guns are mounted in casements in the hull, 2 each at the bow and stern, and 2 amidships. They fire shells that weigh 105 pounds, with a muzzle velocity of about 1,950 feet per second, with a maximum range of 9,000 yards. The Maine is also fitted with anti-torpedo boat armament, which consists of 7 57mm 6-pounder guns mounted on the superstructure of the deck. They fire a shell weighing about 6 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 1,765 feet per second at a rate of 20 rounds per minute to a maximum range of 8,700 yards. Needless to say, the Maine is a deadly fighting machine. In January 1898, the Maine is sent from Key West, Florida, to Havana, Cuba, to protect U.S. interests during the Cuban War of Independence against Spain. This is the last picture of the Maine, entering Havana Harbor, passing in front of the Morro Castle, not long before tragedy strikes. Tensions are high in the island nation as rebels fight to free themselves from Spanish control. There are conspiracies everywhere. Some say Spanish mines litter the waters of Havana Harbor. On the evening of February 15, 1898, the Maine has dropped anchor in the calm waters of the harbor not far from the fortress Morro Castle. At 20 minutes before midnight, with no warning, something aboard the Maine goes terribly wrong. The ship explodes. A massive fireball lights up the Havana sky. The forward third of the ship, where the munitions are stored, disintegrates. Most of the Maine's crew quarters are in the forward part of the vessel. The men die in their bunks, never knowing what hit them. The remainder of the burning ship quickly sinks to the bottom of the harbor. The captain, Charles Sigsbee, and 17 other officers survive, only because their quarters are towards the rear of the vessel. 260 U.S. sailors are killed. Only 89 live to tell the tale. As the sun rises from the east over the Cuban fortress Morro Castle, rescue and salvage crews from the U.S. Navy try to make sense of the twisted metal wreckage that, just a day earlier, was the warship USS Maine. In the quiet harbor the night before, a massive explosion and fireball aboard the ship killed most of its crew and sent the Maine to the ocean floor. Now, mangled pieces of the warship are jutting out above the waves, a reminder of the violence that had occurred just a few hours earlier. In the United States, newspapers scream for revenge. The destruction of a U.S. warship in the middle of Havana Harbor makes a tense situation much worse. Remember the Maine becomes a rallying cry for papers like the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, and the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. Both papers run with the story, devoting thousands of column inches to the sinking. Hearst even announces a $50,000 reward for the conviction of the criminals who sent 258 American sailors to their deaths. Privately, Hearst and Pulitzer don't really believe the Spanish are responsible for the destruction of the Maine, but the newspapermen want a war. It will be good for business. They work the American public into a frenzy, demanding that the Spanish release Cuba from its colonial rule. The Spanish-American War begins 2 months after the sinking of the Maine, meaning there is no opportunity for the United States to raise what is left of the ship and retrieve the dead who are still entombed in their watery graves. However, the war allows a relatively unknown politician from New England to make a lifelong impression on the American people. His name is Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, and he leads a group of hell-raising cavalry soldiers called the Rough Riders into battle on the island. And they famously stormed Cuba's San Juan Hill under heavy fire and destroy the Spanish position there. Roosevelt becomes a national hero, and in 1901, he is elected President of the United States. In December 1910, with hostilities between the U.S. and Spain over, naval officials build a coffer dam that surrounds the wreck of the Maine and drain the water from inside of it. For the first time, they can physically inspect the wreckage that has lain beneath the sea for more than a decade. Officials determined that, in fact, it was some sort of explosive device that had detonated outside the Maine's hull that caused a major explosion in the ship's munitions. The remains of 70 dead sailors are recovered and taken to Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. for burial. What is left of the Maine is refloated, towed to sea, and scuttled in a solemn ceremony. For more than a century, the true reason for the explosion and fire aboard the Maine has been debated. Multiple government committees and even television networks have struggled to determine if a Spanish mine, like the one pictured here, really was responsible for the destruction. Some conclude that a mine had to be the cause of the wreck, while others say volatile coal dust inside the ship's engine room spontaneously combusted and ignited the Maine's massive ammunition stores located below decks, just one room over. To this day, the true cause remains a mystery. Though military warships are some of the most finely operated vessels in the world, they are not immune from fire at sea. Sailing into war zones, loaded with thousands of pounds of ammunition. Battleships, cruisers, submarines, and aircraft carriers are floating powder kegs. And though military personnel are extensively trained on how to avoid tragedy with their volatile cargo, accidents still happen. And when they do, they are often with horrific consequences. The U.S. aircraft carrier Oriskany is a prime example. The Oriskany serves in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Between June and October of 1966, the Oriskany launches nearly 8,000 combat sorties from its location in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. All goes according to plan until October 26, 1966, when a fire erupts on the starboard side of the ship's forward hangar bay. A flare has accidentally ignited near the ship's flare locker. A frantic crew member grabs the flare, but instead of throwing it overboard, he tosses it deeper inside the ship's flare locker, which causes an explosive fire. Aircraft are pushed aside in an effort to save them from the flames. Pilots are hauled from their quarters just as the fire moves toward their rooms. Some crew members frantically move heavy bombs, which are only a few feet away from the raging inferno, and toss them overboard. The flames race through 5 decks of the massive aircraft carrier. The crew works desperately with fire hoses, trying to keep up water pressure to douse the blaze. Foaming fire retardant covers the decks. Thick smoke billows from the aircraft's starboard side, while a blazing inferno rips through the ship, killing 44 crewmen. Many of those killed are pilots who, hours earlier, had returned from missions flown over Vietnam. Most of the bodies of the dead sailors are moved by the ship's massive hoists, where they are kept below decks until the carrier returns to California. At least one of those killed is given an official military burial at sea. There, chaplains say prayers, and every seaman aboard the Oriskany quietly watches as their brother in arms is silently slipped beneath the waves during an hours-long ceremony. Years later, after serving nearly 5 decades as a distinguished fighting ship, the Oriskany meets its watery end. The Navy scuttles the aircraft carrier off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, on May 17, 2006. It takes 37 minutes for the Oriskany to sink beneath the waves. It lands on the bottom exactly upright. It is in waters shallow enough that amateur divers can access the wreck, making the Oriskany the largest accessible man-made underwater reef in the world. Ships carrying ammunition at sea are at high risk. Some say that the Morro Castle, ablaze in 1934 off the shore of New Jersey, is also carrying munitions, running guns and explosives from the United States to Cuban revolutionaries whenever it docked in Havana. These rumors stoked the flames of conspiracy for decades about how the Morro Castle, a well-designed passenger liner only 4 years old, becomes a floating tinderbox. It is the morning of September 8, 1934, along the beach of Asbury Park, New Jersey. The fiery, smoking hulk of the SS Morro Castle, which burned offshore overnight, drifts closer and closer to shore. These are long-forgotten images of a horrific story lost to time. Bodies of passengers and crew who jumped overboard into a raging sea to escape the flames are pulled onto the beach or placed on the Asbury Park Pier. All this is happening in the shadow of the steamship, severely damaged by fire, which is about to beach itself next to the city's convention center. Investigators quickly discovered dozens of reasons why the Morro Castle burned the way it did. The ship's elegant veneered wooden surfaces and glued plywood paneling were highly flammable. Although the ship was built with fire doors, there was a wood-lined 6-inch opening between the ceilings and the steel bulkheads of the doors, which provided a pathway for the flames to spread. There were fire detectors in all of the ship's staterooms, crew quarters, offices, cargo holds, and the engine room, but none in the ship's lounges, dance hall, library, or the writing room where the fire started. There were 42 water hydrants on board, but the ship was designed so only 6 could be used at once. When the fire broke out, the crew opened nearly all 42 hydrants, dropping water pressure to almost zero. There were fire alarms on the ship, but many survivors say they never heard them. Regulations required fire drills to be held on each voyage, but only members of the crew participated. Passengers had no idea what to do when the fire broke out. With the ship firmly beached, authorities are able to board the Morro Castle and retrieve the remains of Captain Robert Wilmot. Wilmot had died of a heart attack in his cabin hours before the Morro Castle caught fire. A newsreel cameraman rides a rope pulley from the convention center to the smoldering ship and takes the first onboard pictures of the destruction. Nothing aboard the ship was safe, even trays of food, which in the fire turned to piles of dust. The charred hulk of the Morro Castle quickly becomes a tourist attraction. Thousands of people come to the shores of Asbury Park to see the smoldering remains. Tens of thousands visit the wreck. The ship is so close to shore that it is possible for the curious to wade out into the water and touch the side of the Morro Castle with their hands. The wreck becomes the most famous tourist attraction on the east coast of the United States that summer. There are even professional sightseeing tours that come complete with souvenir postcards of the burned Morro Castle. The sudden death of the ship's captain a few hours before the fire started stokes speculation that the flames were not an accident. Chief Officer William Worms, who took command of the ship after the captain's death, pointed the burning Morro Castle directly into the wind, fanning the flames. And it took Worms nearly 30 minutes to approve the first SOS to be sent out asking for help. And by then, the fire was out of control. In the inquiries that followed the Morro Castle disaster, there is criticism of the response of the first officer's handling of the ship, the crew's response to the fire, and the delay in calling for assistance. Inquiries conclude that there was no organized effort by the officers to fight and control the fire or close the Morro Castle's fire doors. More damning is the conclusion that, with a few notable exceptions, the crew made no effort to direct passengers to safe pathways to the boat deck. For many passengers, the only course of action was to lower themselves into the water or jump overboard. The few lifeboats that were launched carried primarily crew members, and no efforts were made by these boats to maneuver towards the ship's stern to pick up additional people. The newly promoted Captain Worms never left the bridge to determine the extent of the damage and maintain the ship's bearing at full speed for a long distance after the fire was initially known. As systems failed throughout the Morro Castle because of power loss, no effort was made to use the emergency steering gear or emergency lighting. Worms, Chief Engineer Eben Abbott, and Wardline Vice President Henry Cabot are eventually indicted on various charges relating to the incident, including willful negligence. And all three are convicted and sentenced to jail. However, an appeals court overturns Worms and Abbott's convictions, deciding that a fair amount of the blame could be attributed to the dead Captain Wilmot. In the inquiry that followed the disaster, Chief Radio Operator George White Rogers is made out to be a hero because, having been unable to get a clear order from the bridge, he sent a distress call on his own accord amidst life-threatening conditions. Later, however, suspicion is directed at Rogers when he is convicted of attempting to murder a police colleague with an incendiary device. In 1954, Rogers is convicted of murdering a neighboring couple for money, and he dies 3.5 years later in prison. To this day, Rogers is the main suspect in the fire aboard the Morro Castle. And though the official cause of the blaze has never been determined, many believe the Morro Castle was a victim of arson. Regardless of its cause, the fire aboard the Morro Castle served to improve fire safety for future ships. The use of fire retardant materials, automatic fire doors, ship-wide fire alarms, the necessity of emergency generators, mandatory crew training and firefighting procedures, and greater attention to fire drills. They all result directly from the Morro Castle disaster. There are few tragedies more horrific than fires at sea. Since ships first set sail on the water, fire has been a constant, lethal danger. A horrific inferno can strike without warning. It is indiscriminate in the types of ships it attacks. From excursion boats out for a day trip, to the most mighty vessels of a military at war. surrounded by nothing but blue water and sky. An uncontrolled fire at sea is a sailor's worst nightmare. A waterborne inferno from which there is no escape.